Hello everyone, I just wanted to record a quick video for those of you who are less familiar with writing a design specification, just to go through the process of how we actually do that. So this presentation is going to include, first of all, what a design specification actually is and why we need it. Then I'm going to move on to actually the process of writing a design specification and what we need to include in our design specification. And then finally, I'll finish off with some common errors that I notice from design specifications that people give to me. The first thing to understand is where the design specification fits within the design process itself. So this is a rather complicated diagram. You don't need to fully understand it really, but essentially we're moving from the left-hand side, which is our challenge, our original brief that we were given, through to the blue box on the right-hand side, which is actually delivering a solution. And the process we're in at the moment is that we've completed the first part of this diagram, this first diamond, the red diamond that says research and define, and we're reaching the point in the center, which is the red dot. And before we move on to the red dot in the middle is our design specification. Essentially, we're taking all the research that we've done and we are summarizing it in order to then move on to the ideation phase to come up with potential solutions. So a design specification is a written document. It's an easy to read document that describes and defines the requirements for the design. So very importantly, what it is it is a list of needs, requirements. It's not a list of things that you would quite like, that you would want from this, that you might think would be in there. It's a list of only the things that your design really requires in order to fulfill what you need it to do. So what the design specification does is it distills all of that research, which can be quite a large amount of stuff. It distills it all down into one easy to read document with bullet points that focus on what is the relevant parts, what are the relevant parts of that research. And it filters out all of the irrelevant parts of your research. So it's a very valuable document to have. With a design specification, you must apply it strictly throughout your design process. You must be constantly referring to your design specification to check that any solutions you come up with are actually going to be mirrored in that design specification. And importantly, it is a living document though, which means that you can change your design specification as you go through the project. However, you must be very, very careful. Any changes you make to your design specification as you go through the project must be fully justified. Why do we actually need a design specification? Well, first of all, very importantly, it creates what's called a solution space for the designer. What that means is that it puts up boundaries and it says, okay, these solutions that you have actually fit within these boundaries, within this box that we're defining, and these solutions that you've come up with sit outside of that box, and so therefore we can disregard them. We don't need to go any further with those solutions. So it allows you as a designer to design more easily. It's very difficult to design something if there are very few boundaries, but it actually puts very specific boundaries in place. And in doing that, what it does is it ensures that your solution you're going to end up with actually addresses the needs that are defined by your research. So there's an example there I've put of two cars. We've got the McLaren at the top and the Hyundai underneath. And you can see perhaps that maybe the design part of the design specification for those two items may have been the same. You know, essentially they are both cars. They both go from A to B. However, they've obviously been designed for very different requirements. They've been designed for different markets. They've been designed for different speeds, different acceleration rates. They've been designed for different costs. So those things will differ with the two design specifications. And what it means is you create your design specification is it means that you know with your design specification whether you are designing a McLaren, whether you're designing a sports car, or whether you are designing a family car, the Hyundai. So without that document, it's very easy to get confusion coming into the process. So often the design specification forms a formal agreement with your client. So your client actually understands, as part of a contract, understands what you are going to be producing. So it's useful to share your design specification with the rest of the team on Sonamoni so that we actually understand what you're working towards. Design specification is also useful for evaluating your design solutions. So I said earlier that you should be referring to your design specification throughout the process. So whenever you're coming up with solutions, you should be checking how well they fit your design specification. And they should fit all of the sections of your design specification. Doing that, what it does is it provides a checklist for a comprehensive design process. I'll explain a little bit more about how it does that later on. And so finally, what it can do is it can reduce the chance of miscommunication and assumptions. There from Eugene Lewis Fordsworth, who said that assumption is the mother of all mistakes. And that's very true. A lot of projects fall apart because of miscommunication and assumptions that people are making about what other people might be doing. I showed you the design process diagram earlier on, and you might have noticed that there was a phrase that went along with this section, this red dot in the center that says parameters, and the phrase was solution neutral problem statement, and that's essentially a description of what a design specification is. So if we pick through that phrase, then it'll help us to understand what a design specification is a little bit more easily. First of all, our design specification needs to be solution neutral. What that means is that when you're writing your specification, you must only concentrate on what the research itself is telling you. You must keep any potential solutions out of your mind when you're writing it. So the example that I've given there is that if your brief is to create an implement to help someone eat pasta, then you mustn't assume that it is necessarily the solution is going to be a fork. There are all sorts of implements that might be useful to help somebody eat pasta that don't result in a fork. So it allows you to have a very open way of ideating, and that you can come up with solutions that perhaps nobody else has come up with. The second part of that phrase is the word problem. Importantly, your specification must be informed by the research that you've done into the problem itself. And you've got to make sure that the problem is the cause and you're not tackling the symptoms of what you're looking at. Please understand what the actual problem is before you write your design specification. And the final part of this statement is the word statement. It is a statement of fact. Your design specification is not made up of any opinions. It's not made up of any conjecture at all. It is a list of solid facts. It's not a report, it's not a design report, so it should be bullet pointed or kept to short sections. Always write your design specification in the third person. So that means rather than saying, I would like this thing to be whatever, you say, the design needs to be whatever. And when you're writing your design specification, you should try to quantify your parameters as much as possible. It's no use in your design specification if you say the solution needs to be quite expensive or fairly cheap. Those are very vague statements. What we want is something more precise. So you need to define, for example, this is going to cost no more than £30, £20, £10, whatever the figure is, put a number on it. So I've got a diagram there which was created by a gentleman called Stuart Pugh, who wrote a very famous book called Total Design. And essentially he said that in your design specification there should be, or there could be, 35 different sections, 35 different areas that you should consider when you're coming up with your solution, your design solution. Now, it's very likely that you won't require all 35 of those sections in your design specification. But it's worthwhile thinking about each one of them to see whether there is something that applies within each one of those sections to the specification you are writing. For example, there's a section on the diagram here to do with politics. And politics are very often not an issue when you're designing for most products, but they may well be an issue with the things that we're coming up with for Sonamoni. I have put to the right hand side, you can see I've narrowed it down to a list of items which are commonly in 95% of design specifications. So I'd expect you to certainly be considering all of these things when you're writing your design specification. So I'll just run through a few of these to help you understand what they mean a little bit more. That list we have says scope and background and performance. So you can see an example on the left hand side of the screen there of a design specification that was written for a learning aid for hearing impaired or deaf children to use in schools. So the first section we can see, which is labelled 1.0, is scope, and the scope essentially narrows down, puts boundaries on what this project is actually about. If you can do it within a sentence, then try to do that. You can use 2 sentences at the most, but you should be narrowing down in as concise a way as possible what this project is about. So in the example there, it might be quite small for you to see, but it says this specification relates to a classroom learning aid for UK primary school children aged 5 to 7 years to learn British Sign Language in order to prevent the isolation of deaf or hearing impaired children. So there's quite a lot of very precise boundaries being put just in that sentence. We're saying it relates to classroom learning. So this is going to be used in a classroom, in a school. This is not for home use. It's going to be used in the classroom. It's a learning aid, so therefore it needs to help you to learn. It is for UK primary school children aged 5 to 7 years. So we're defining very early on. It's not being designed for anybody else. This is purely for use by UK primary school children aged 5 to 7 years. And it's to help them learn British Sign Language. So we're not concerned about any other kind of sign language or any other languages. This is just British Sign Language. And then at the end of that sentence, we're stating exactly what the point of this project is. It's in order to prevent the isolation of deaf or hearing impaired children. So within the scope, in the space of one sentence, we're very clearly laying out the scope of this project. The second section is the background section. You can see this is a little bit longer, the background section, and this is essentially where you can put some information which is helpful for people to understand about the project, which explains a little bit more why you have specific numbers within that design specification. For example, within our background there, the example that I've got, it actually explains what the problem is, and then it describes how many deaf children there are in mainstream schooling, what percentage there are, and how many deaf children there are in the UK. And from that, that means that we can make an estimate of how many deaf children this might be, who might require this solution. And so we're using our background research in that way to come up with very specific numbers. As I said earlier on, try and specify your parameters as much as you possibly can. And then after the scope and the background, then we go into all the other sections, which come under, you can see there, it says 3.0 details. So these are all the details of what your design needs to have. So the first one of these is the performance. And the performance actually states one by one the different technical attributes or things that this solution needs to do. We then move on to sections about market and users. It's important for you to understand the difference between a market and a user. The market is the person who would be purchasing the item. The user is the person who will be using it. So in the example that I've just given about the learning aid for deaf children, the market would be schools or local government organisations who would be buying this item. Our users would be the children themselves. And we could also include the school teachers in the users because they might have to set this item up for the children. So we've got two very distinct groups of people there. So you need to define who's your market and who are your users. It's also useful then to include a section on ergonomics. So the ergonomics can include anthropometric data to describe what ergonomic requirements there need to be from this solution. Now, it's very, very difficult to design a solution for everybody. So we often get used to, in design specifications, relating our ergonomics to a phrase called the 5th to 95th percentile. And hopefully that diagram on the left-hand side helps you to understand that a little bit more. This is the distribution of height across a population. So what we do in saying that we're going to be designing for the 5th to 95th percentile is we are excluding the population at the lower end of the height frequency there in that diagram, and the 5% at the top end of the height frequency. So we're essentially excluding people who are very, very short and people who are very, very tall, but we're including the 90% of the population that sits between those two measurements. So often within your design specification you will say this is designed for male or female users between the 5th and 95th percentile. We then come on to a section on materials and manufacture. The thing to say about materials and manufacture is not to be too specific about it. Although this is a design specification, often there is an issue with people being too specific with materials or manufacture. Essentially what we want to be saying is that our materials should be, we're talking about the quality they need to have. Do they need to be robust? Do they need to be waterproof? Do they need to be easily cleanable? Rather than saying specifically, okay, this needs to be made of steel or needs to be made of wood or needs to be made of fabric. It's very rarely that you need to define that specifically within a design specification. Likewise with manufacture. The manufacturing section, we're really talking about how many things are going to be manufactured. Is this going to be low quantity manufacture? Is it going to be something called batch manufacture, which means producing a small quantity at a time? That's probably most likely for a lot of the things for Sonamoni, where we might be producing 500 of these at a time. It's very unlikely that we'll be manufacturing high quantities of these. So think about the quantities rather than specifying exactly how this thing is going to be made. Because at this point, we haven't come up with any solution. Remember, we're being solution neutral. So it's impossible for us to say what materials are going to be used or how this thing is going to be manufactured. That won't be defined until later on. Let's have sections on cost and price. Just so that you're aware, cost and price are two different things. The cost is how much it is going to cost for us to manufacture, and the price is how much somebody will actually have to pay for this, if this is something which is going to be bought. So just to give you a tip, typically the cost is around 1/3 of the retail price, but it may be that with Sonamoni, because we are producing different types of intervention, that may be a little bit more flexible than it would normally be. So that might need a discussion later on. I'm just going to move through the list now and just come to the sections on environment and sustainability. I'm just going to explain the difference between those two sections. Environment doesn't mean environmental issues. For example, environmental impacts of materials and things like that. That goes in the sustainability section. Environment means what is the environment in which this is going to be operating, your solution is going to be operating. For example, is it going to come into contact with water? Is it going to come into contact with salt water? Is it going to be rained on? Is it going to be exposed to UV from the sun? Is it going to be exposed to dirt or dust or mud or sand? Think about all of these different things. One of the most important things to think about is what temperature range it's going to be exposed to. What's the highest temperatures this might be exposed to, and what are the lowest temperatures this might be exposed to? And that may well dictate some of the materials we're using. Right at the bottom there we have life in service and design lifespan. These are two things which are often confused by people. Life in service is how long I can expect this item to last in normal use. So the example I've got there is of a tote bag for King Charles's coronation that was produced last year. So life in service might be a length of time. I might say that this bag would be usable for the next 3 years, 5 years, something like that, before it starts falling apart. However, it also might be determined by number of uses. Instead of saying 3 years, I could say, okay, it will last for 500 trips to the shop. So think about life in service and how you actually define that. It could be how many uses, could be length of time. The design lifespan is slightly different. The design lifespan is how long would I be expected to make this current design before it becomes outdated or outmoded. So with something like the tote bag that we have there for the coronation, that would have a very short design lifespan. I'm not going to be producing this for 10 years. I'll produce it, do a small production run of this, a short production run of this, and then I won't be producing anymore, and I'll need to change my design to a different kind of tote bag because no one will want to buy coronation tote bags for King Charles's coronation. So just when you're filling in those two sections, just remember the difference between those two. I'm just going to finish off now with some common errors that I see in design specifications. The most important one, the one I see more often than anything else, is that people waffle too much. There is always too much waffle. Keep this short. We don't want a 17-page document. We want something relatively short, which is easy to refer to. Please be specific with what you say. I said earlier on about defining your parameters, so quantify as much as you possibly can, especially with things like costs or heights or weights of things or quantities of things. Do try and leave nothing out. It can be difficult when you're writing your first design specification to include everything, because if you haven't written one before, then you don't know what to include. But try and include absolutely everything. Do have a look at that diagram and the list that I've put in this presentation to see if you're including all of these sections. Do be sure to check on a solution neutral design specification. So what you are doing is you're specifying what this thing needs to do, not how it does it. One of the things that I often get in design specifications is people say, for example, this needs to be battery operated, or it needs to be solar operated. Think to yourself, okay, does it have to be battery operated? Could it be powered by any other method? And if so, then don't say that it needs to be battery operated. There could be other ways of powering this thing. So don't over specify in those senses. And then finally, the overarching thing to say is please don't have any solutions in mind when you're writing your design specification. Just focus on the research you've done and focus on the problem. That's been a helpful summary to everybody. Please do feel free to get in touch with me if you need to know more about writing design specifications, or if you would like me to have a look through your design specification to check. I'm very happy to do that.